Well, with permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement on Syria. Over less than a fortnight, there has been an extraordinary change. What began as an opposition offensive in northwestern Syria quickly became a headlong retreat by pro-Assad forces, and over the weekend, the fall of his murderous regime. On the 30th of November, the regime withdrew from Aleppo. On the 5th of December, Hama. On the 6th of December, Dara and Homs. And on the 7th of December, Damascus. Madam Deputy Speaker, as this government came into office, some in the international community and some in this House asked whether we would re-engage with Assad. His Russian and Iranian allies have long championed him. Last year, he returned to the Arab League, and increasingly other governments were also starting to step up their presence in Damascus. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government chose not to re-engage. We said no, because Assad is a monster. We said no because Assad was a dictator whose sole interest was his wealth and his power. And we said no because Assad is a criminal who defied all laws and norms to use chemical weapons against the Syrian people. We said no because Assad is a butcher with the blood of countless innocents on his hands. And we said no because Assad was a drug dealer, funding his regime through Captagon and illicit finance. And we said no because he was never, ever going to change. There were those who used to call Assad the Lion of Damascus. Now we see the reality. Assad is the rat of Damascus, fleeing to Moscow with his tail between his legs. How fitting he should end up there. We see streets of Syrians cheering his demise, tearing down his statues, reuniting with loved ones who have been disappeared. We have long hoped to see him gone and welcome the opportunity this brings for the people of Syria. Assad's demise is not just a humiliation to him and his henchmen, it is a humiliation for Russia and Iran. Iran's so-called axis of resistance is crumbling before our eyes, and Vladimir Putin's attempts to prop up Assad for more than a decade. And all that he's got for this is a fallen dictator filing for asylum in Moscow. He says he wants to return Russia to its imperial glory, but after more than 1,000 days, he has not subjugated Ukraine. Putin's fake empire stops short just a few miles out of Donetsk. I have no fear of it, only disgust. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, our revulsion of Assad, his henchmen, and those who propped him up must not blind us to the risks of this moment. Assad's demise brings no guarantee of peace. This is a moment of danger, as well as opportunity for Syrians and for the region. The humanitarian situation in Syria is dire, with almost 17 million people in need. Millions are refugees, largely still in neighbouring Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan. Seeing so many start to return to Syria is a positive sign for their hopes for a better future now that Assad is gone. But a lot depends on what happens now. This flow into Syria could quickly become a flow back out and potentially increase the numbers using dangerous illegal migration routes to continental Europe and the United Kingdom. Syria has also proven a hotbed of extremism. This House will know that the group whose offensive first pushed back the regime, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS as it's now being called, are also a proscribed terrorist organisation in the UK as an alias of Al-Qaeda. That should rightly make us cautious. Thus far, HTS has offered reassurances to minorities in Aleppo, Hama, and Damascus. They have also committed to cooperating with the international community over monitoring chemical weapons. We will judge ATS by their actions, monitoring closely how they and other parties to this conflict treat all civilians in areas they control. The UK and our allies have spent over a decade combating terrorism in Syria. Daesh remains one of the most significant terrorist threats to the UK, our allies and our interests overseas. We take seriously our duty as government to protect the public from this and other terrorist threats. Amid this uncertainty, the government has three priorities. First and foremost, protecting all civilians, including, of course, minorities. For more than a decade, Syria has been racked by terrible sectarian violence. We continue to do what we can to provide humanitarian support wherever we can. The UK has spent over £4 billion on the Syrian crisis to date. UK-funded mobile medical units already provide emergency services across northern Syria. Last week, we gave a further £300,000 to the White Helmets. And today, the Prime Minister has announced an additional £11 million of humanitarian support for Syrians. Second, securing an inclusive, negotiated political settlement, as I discussed with the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, yesterday. This is how the Syrian people can begin to chart a path to a united and peaceful Syria. And finally, preventing escalation into the wider region. For more than a year, the Middle East has been in the grips of a series of interlocking conflicts, which threaten to become an ever more catastrophic war. And in Syria itself, Russia and Iran have kept Assad's regime on life support. If we are to achieve a better future for Syrians, we should let Syrians themselves determine their future. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must learn from this crisis another lesson too. Illicit finance was a fundamental part of Assad's playbook, and it's a part of Putin's playbook and the playbook of dictators and criminals around the world. This hurts ordinary people in our own country and people in Syria. It drives up crime and it drives up house prices here in the UK. And that is why today I'm announcing £36 million in new funding for the National Crime Agency on anti-corruption. A new anti-corruption champion in Margaret Hodge, and new sanctions on those using the illicit gold trade. And previous governments have neglected this fight. For this government, it's a mission-critical issue. And Madam Deputy Speaker, with events moving so quickly, the government has been taking every available opportunity to underlie our priorities. Today, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is in the region visiting the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Just over the weekend, I've discussed the situation with my Turkish, my Israeli, my Emirati and my Jordanian counterparts, as well as the UN envoy. My honourable friend, Minister Faulkner, was also just come back from the region attending the Doha Forum and the Myanmar Dialogue. Whatever the coming days bring, I can reassure the House that our intense diplomatic engagement will continue. And Madam Deputy Speaker, Assad's victims can be found all over the world. Many have found sanctuary here in the UK over the years, including filmmaker Wad al-Khatib. And as she said, there's now hope for Syrians to get their country back. The UK stands by Syrians like Wad, by Assad's victims across the world. In the face of uncertainty and new dangers, we will secure the UK against terrorism and illegal migration while helping Syrians to achieve a better future. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for his statement. The Conservative government called for President Assad to go over a decade ago, and few will shed any tears at this vile tyrant's removal from office. He bears responsibility for countless deaths, torture of his opponents, the use of chemical weapons, and repression on a horrendous scale. 500,000 people have died as a result of his abhorrent actions and this conflict. We all remember the shocking images day after day of the barbaric impact of this conflict and the debates in this House, including the indecision of the West to respond to chemical weapon attacks, which should weigh heavily on our conscience. While Assad may have sought sanctuary in Russia, we look to the Foreign Secretary to explain what steps will be taken to gather evidence of the crimes his reprehensible regime is responsible for, and the actions being taken to bring him to face justice. And in view of the situation in Syria, I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary what the government's assessment is of the implications for the Syrian resettlement programme, and can he confirm that despite Assad fleeing to Russia to claim asylum, there will be no asylum claims from former members of the Assad regime in this country, many of whom will be associated with human rights abuses. Madam Deputy Speaker, what happens next, as the Foreign Secretary has said, is critically important for the civilians of Syria, who have endured so much trauma and tragedy, and for the wider region. Syrians need to be protected by those now controlling territory, and that means the protection of all communities, groups and minorities. The House must speak with one voice on that, and some will ask what the UK can do and what should we or should we not do. There are no easy answers in the days ahead, but I say it is profoundly in our national interest that we take whatever action we can, including with our partners, to help counter any further instability in Syria. Like ministers, I was also in the region this weekend discussing the situation with some of our key and crucial partners. With large porous borders, violence, insurgency and the flow of weapons in the region, can the Foreign Secretary give details of the work being undertaken to strengthen and secure the borders of neighbouring countries? And there is a significant risk of a power vacuum in Syria, which could lead to a breakdown of law and order, and of course a proliferation of criminal activities, including the smuggling of weapons and drug production on an industrial scale. So can the Foreign Secretary give an update on the actions being taken to monitor and respond to these criminal activities? Can he also comment on the risk to our security from foreign terrorist fighters being freed from prisons? And can he give his assessment of the risk of the state's weapons, including potential chemical weapons, falling into the control of those who would cause us harm and threaten our security? Instability can also fuel a rise in extremism, not only in Syria, and there is a risk that ISIS will seek to exploit the present situation, but at home this is also an issue. So can the Foreign Secretary inform the House as to whether a cross-government review of the security and defence implications and the implications for terrorism risks is underway? And of course, to what level can he share, and I appreciate this might not be fully in this House, what discussions are underway with our intelligence partners to counter extremist and security threats from the region itself? Hayat Tahrir al-Sharam's historic links to al-Qaeda and their ideology is too well known, and therefore they have been prescribed for good reasons. So can the Foreign Secretary give a timetable for the reported review of HTS and share the details of the legal mechanism he'll be using for that review? Can he give assurances that the government with its partners will be considering the potential threat that HTS poses immediately, both for Syria and the region, as well as our own interests? Security considerations, Madam Deputy Speaker, should always be a number one consideration for us all. And we should not forget where this group originally came from. We need to be looking not just at their words, but at their actions. And for years, the Assad regime has been bailed out by the Russians, the Iranians and Hezbollah. But with Russia now focused on its illegal invasion in Ukraine, and with Iran's presence in the region now depleted, can the Foreign Secretary give the government's assessment of how this change in Syria will affect the dynamics of the current situation in the time ahead? And what is the strategy for dealing with Iran, who still want a foothold in Syria to exploit and funnel the misery that we have seen for too long? While we must work towards a better future for Syria, I hope the Foreign Secretary will agree that we must ensure that this government remains alert and prepared for the risks and threats that could still emerge.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Foreign Shadow Secretary for her remarks, and indeed she was in touch with me last week about her own concerns at what was taking place, and we were able to correspond. So I'm grateful for the manner in which we've been able to engage on this very, very serious issue. She raises quite rightly the terrible human rights record of Russia and Iran in backing this grim, brutal regime. And she's absolutely right that they should be held account for their actions. Now, she will know that we have not got a diplomatic presence in Syria at this time, and indeed the Syrians do not have a diplomatic presence here in the UK. So recording these actions is not straightforward, but of course we continue to work, as you would expect, with NGOs and civil society to support them in their efforts, and we will see over the coming days and weeks how they are able to both record and hold to account those that kept Syria under this brutal regime, not just in fact for the last 13 years, but for the years before that under Assad's father's regime as well. She raises the issue of Syrian resettlement. Let me just say that that is premature. This House, in a cross-party basis, and she indeed saw this in her own role previously in government, has sought to support the humanitarian needs of Syrians. We recognise the displacement next door in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, and in Iraq and neighbouring countries, and of course we will continue to support people in those refugee camps and through the humanitarian aid that we support in country at this time. She also raises, of course, the tremendous issues that exist on the ground and our concerns, quite rightly, about increased terrorism that might engulf a country where there are at the moment different sections, different communities, different minorities, different regions, not just, in fact, HDS has been read in the papers. And against that backdrop, of course, a COBRA has been stood up to fully understand these issues across government. It wouldn't be right to comment on intelligence matters at this time, but she will understand that government is active, as she would expect us to be. And she's absolutely right about the threat, not just of terrorism, but of illicit drugs as well. And having just come back from the region, she, I'm sure, will have heard Gulf allies raise the issue of Captagon and illegal drugs that also propped up Assad's regime and found their ways flooding into Gulf countries, and that's something, of course, that we continue to monitor. None of us want to see Syria become like Libya next door, fractured and vulnerable to different terrorist groups potentially, and we will do all we can. That is why I spoke to the UN envoy yesterday, and I will continue to stay in close dialogue with him. It's why I spoke to Jordan, to Turkey, to the UAE and others. The UK will do all it can to support this new representative process that has the people of Syria at its heart. When we look at the jubilation, we want that jubilation to continue, not to be replaced by another bloody and brutal regime.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all celebrate across the House the end of this terrible regime. But the very last thing that the Syrian people want, as my right honourable friend has said, is for one tyrant to be replaced by another, but the second has an Islamic flag. So there is another way, but it's not going to be easy, and I'm glad to hear that my right honourable friend has begun talking to the UN Special Representative, because there are other plans. There have been Syrians working on other plans, on other constitutions and laws over a long period under the auspices of the United Nations. But what is desperately needed now is to ensure that there are inclusive transitional arrangements put in place that can take Syria into a brighter world, into the sort of Syria that, frankly, has a political system that the long-suffering Syrian people need and deserve, and could give them the sort of country that this extraordinary, multi-ethnic, multi-background country could do. So I hope that that is our priorities, and that we don't simply sit back and say, oh, well, what can we do?
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for the question, and she's absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have to ensure that Druze, that Alawites, that Christians, as well as Sunni, Shia, Muslims, Kurds, have a place in this vast, ancient and important country, and that they are protected, and that civilian life is protected. That's why Minister Faulkner just yesterday was speaking to representatives of civil society. And it's why I was discussing what happens now. For example, Iran supplied the oil to Syria. Who will supply that oil now? We have to find ways in which public officials in Syria can be paid so that they can do that job. And we desperately, over the coming hours, need to get policing back in Syria so that there is not widespread disorder. For all of those reasons, she's right that we must work with civil society and local partners.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for early sight of his statement. The fall of the Assad regime is momentous for the millions of Syrians who have suffered under his brutal rule. The Al Assad dynasty were despots who used chemical weapons against their own people. The images emerging today from Saidnaya prison illustrate the lengths the regime took to murder, torture and silence its opponents. So can the Foreign Secretary tell the House today what steps are being taken to ensure that both Bashar and his brother Bashar al Assad face justice for the crimes which they have committed? These developments create immediate strategic challenges for the UK. Can the Foreign Secretary assure the House that the UK is taking urgent action with our allies to identify, locate and secure the stockpiles of chemical weapons in Syria? And what assessment can he offer of how this change will impact Russian military capabilities, particularly in respect of its bases at Latakia and Tartus? Madam Deputy Speaker, there is joy for many liberated Syrians today. This has been a national process of liberation, not just that of any one group. And the international community must learn the lessons of other regime changes and seek to support a process of reconciliation and transition that is led by the Syrian people and not imposed from outside. So can the Foreign Secretary say in a little more detail how the UK will support an inclusive national process that leads to a fresh constitution and, in due course, free and fair elections? And can he reassure the House that any recognition of a new government in Syria will depend on sustained evidence that political, minority and human rights are being protected? The Foreign Secretary is right that the displacement of civilians from Syria under Assad has deepened the need for humanitarian support in the region. The Foreign Secretary mentions £11 million in emergency funding, but the annual drop in humanitarian and other aid to Syria from the UK from 2016 to 2022 was £289 million. So can the Foreign Secretary agree with me today that there is an urgent need to restore the UK's aid budget to help displaced people in their home countries so they have less need to flee overseas? Madam Deputy Speaker, Assad has fallen. We should act swiftly to support the UK's strategic interests in the region. We must do all we can to ensure that what rises in its place represents all those Syrians who yearn to live peacefully side by side with their neighbours.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question, and he's right to start by saying that Russia and Iran must be held to account for the way that they propped up this regime and supported a man that used chemical weapons on his own population. I hope that he welcomes the further sanctions that I announced and the appointment of Baroness Hodge to lead across government on issues of illicit finance. And of course we will work with others, including the French, on the actions that they have brought. He raises very importantly the issue of stockpiles of chemical weapons. Now, he will have seen that Giuliani has been clear that he will not use chemical weapons, and he will work with the OPCW on that issue going forward. We monitor that very, very closely. Any use of chemical weapons would be grievous, and the international community would have to come together to do all we could to support the Syrian people. He also raises of what more can we do. At this point in time, the key thing is to work with key countries in the region, particularly neighbours and Arab partners, to work closely with our E3 partners particularly, and the current US government and those incoming. That is the key combination, to do all we can to support Syria at this time. I mentioned the real concerns about disorder, the real concerns about energy supply and oil, and how we support the public sector to move forward in the appropriate manner, paid, so that people can do their job. And when he raises the point about aid, I think we should just reflect, were the British people and this Parliament and Parliaments before it not united in supporting Syria with a record amount of sums, more than any other country in the world, just imagine where Syria would be today, notwithstanding the amount of displaced peoples and the challenges that currently exist.
Chair of the International Development Committee, Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Since the 28th of November, almost 1 million Syrians, most of them women and children, have been displaced internally due to the recent violence. More than 7.2 million Syrians are internally displaced, and around 6.2 are long-term refugees, mostly in neighbouring countries. The Foreign Secretary is right to say that Assad's fall could allow millions of refugees to finally return home, but what comes next could also escalate the country's displacement crisis. So can you tell us some more about what steps he's taking with our partners on the worst-case scenario? And will he commit to continuing, indeed increasing, our support for host refugee countries, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, for example?
Well, my right honourable friend raises these issues with tremendous experience. She will know that Syria faced the most displaced people internally, of course, that provides various pressures. And of course, if chaos or further violence were to ensue over the coming days, there would be further displacement within the country. And she rightly raises the issues for neighbouring countries, all of whom have been very keen to speak to me and this government about the pressures that they would face from further displacement. So I want to reassure her that that has been something I've discussed, particularly with Turkey and with Jordan at this time, and they want to work with us to make what is coming in Syria work as best it can for the local population.
James Cleverly.
Syria now presents a toxic mix. It is a large, heavily armoured but now ungoverned country. There are a range of militia groups affiliated to both state and non-state actors. It has a number of fragile neighbours, and we are at a fork in the road moment. So rather than talking about Syria with neighbours, what specific action will the UK government take to ensure that we maximise the chance of success and minimise the chance of failure? For example, will we re-establish a diplomatic presence in Damascus? and if so, on what timescale? And in the period now ahead of the inauguration of President-elect Trump, what action will we take with the American administration to make sure that there isn't a hiatus before the Trump administration takes formal office?
Well, I want to reassure the honourable gentleman that, of course, we are talking to the American administration. Now, I know when he was Foreign Secretary, he tried to move quickly, but announcing within 24 hours that we're reopening an embassy in Syria would be hasty. The pressing issue at this time is the humanitarian aid issue, is working with partners to ensure the issues around energy and order that I think all are raising with us. And of course we will continue to reflect on our ongoing diplomatic relations with Syria. He will recognise too from his time in office that we have particular concerns about the northeastern corridor in Syria and some of our real counter-terrorism and Daesh concerns, which is of course number one in UK considerations.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome everything in the Foreign Secretary's statement today? And he's right that we mustn't be blind to the risks of this moment. I'd just like to ask him about two groups. Firstly, the millions of Syrians who have fled Syria over past decades and what his hope is for them in this future process. And also the Kurdish community. It was one of the largest ethnic communities without a state. And I wonder what hope he has to engage them in this process for the future.
Well, he's right to raise, of course, the displaced people, many of whom are beginning that journey back home. I think the important thing is that they go home to a country that continues to fuel the hope in their hearts and can cope with this new increased population that will no doubt be in demand of public services. And he raises the Kurdish minority group also in the country. As I have said, as the UN envoy has said, this has to be an inclusive country that has a place for everyone. But he will also recognise that in that northeastern corridor, we work with all partners, but we keep a close eye on anything that comes anywhere close to terrorism.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Does the Foreign Secretary agree that we should not be surprised that one war criminal, President Putin, is now sheltering another war criminal, Assad? However, he will also be aware that there are substantial assets owned by Assad or those linked to him which are frozen in this country. Will he look to see in due course whether we might use those for the benefit of the people of Syria?
Yes, absolutely I will. And, you know, he's right. We look at some of the horrors in the world. Syria, of course. Sudan, not far away. Ukraine. And sitting behind them is the hand of Putin. And that is why we must do all we can to hold him to account for the tyranny that he's reigning across the world.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A few days ago I met with Sausan Abu Zainadine from Syrian NGO Madaniya. She speaks powerfully of the shared responsibility of Syrians to now build an inclusive state governed by law and citizenship. Will the Foreign Secretary commit to increasing UK support to civil society in Syria as they do this? Will he also commit to increased support to human rights experts, including the UN, as they document the horrific crimes that have been committed against Syrian civilians and work to bring to justice those who are responsible?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and in the 11 million that I've announced, of course, there is further support for civil society, which will be absolutely vital at this time.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And today my thoughts are with Bashar al Assad and Musa Darsani and their families and all those Syrian refugees who escaped Assad's brutality to resettle on the Isle of Bute. Their hope, and the hope of all the people of Syria, will be that Syrians are now able to secure the peaceful future that they want, rather than becoming a battlefield in another's proxy war. Given that, how would he explain and legally justify that, having waited 5 decades to be free of Assad, that on day one, those Syrians that he referenced in his statement, who were on the streets cheering the demise of Assad, were on the receiving end of a massive Israeli airstrike? Good question.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that I did speak to my Israeli counterpart yesterday. I do think it's right to understand that there are legitimate security concerns for Israel, particularly in the context of a country that's housed ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Daesh. I wish it were as simplistic as the honourable gentleman seems to think it is. It's for all of those reasons that we want an inclusive society that supports everyone, but none of us can have truck with terrorist groups.
Tanmanjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the demise of Assad's regime in Syria, my thoughts are with the Syrian people who have been left to pick up the pieces of his barbaric actions, including his use of chemical weapons. And no doubt now, having propped up his brutal rule for over a decade, both Putin and the Iranian leadership are nursing their bloody nose. Now, I know that peace and stability will be foremost in everybody's minds, and I understand that the government is urgently reviewing lifting the terrorism prescription on Syrian rebel groups, but surely there must be an undertaking beforehand that the rights of women and minorities are secured. And Secretary of State, following the recent reports of Israeli strikes against chemicals weapons depots in Syria, what measures are being undertaken in collaboration with our international partners to ensure that those are secured and that they do not cause harm to civilians?
Well, I'm grateful to the Chair of the Defence Select Committee. He's right to raise the importance of women, and I want to reassure him that the funds that we are making available are absolutely going to support women. He mentions prescription. I want to make it clear that the situation on the ground in Syria, of course, is very fluid. Our priority at this time is, of course, the safety of Syrian civilians, but let me be absolutely clear, we don't comment on issues of prescription for good reason, but we should recognise that Al-Qaeda killed hundreds of British citizens in barbaric attacks spanning decades, and that was the original reason that this organisation, HTS, was prescribed.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've never regretted my vote in favour of military action in 2013, and I most certainly welcome the fact that President Assad has been brought down now. I welcome what the Foreign Secretary has to say on humanitarian aid, but there are a myriad, in fact, of Security Council resolutions in place on humanitarian aid, on the rebuilding of Syria, and in all its forms. What role does the Foreign Secretary see the UN and indeed these Security Council resolutions playing as we go forward?
Well, he's right to raise the importance of the UN. Resolution 254, particularly in relation to Syria. If he reviews that resolution, he will see that it largely deals with the assumption that there would be the regime in place that we've had, Assad. So it is important to support the UN Special Representative at this time. I think there must be, if Syria is to succeed, a greater role for the UN, and of course I intend to discuss these issues with the Secretary-General and others in the coming days and weeks.
David Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I share the delight of my Syrian friends that Assad has gone, and I only wish that the world had acted to support the Syrian people sooner, and that our dear friend Joe was around to see it. I want to pay tribute to Minister Faulkner for meeting with the British-Syrian Consortium over the weekend in Doha, and I look forward to our further meeting with him and them in due course. Now, despite the denials of Assad's and the downplaying of Assad's crimes over the years, including by some members of this House, what is undeniable is that there are hundreds of thousands of people imprisoned by Assad, including in Sednaya prison. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is an urgent need to release those prisoners. Some of them are several stories down, and there are reports on the ground that people are unable to free them at the moment, such as the electronic locks that they put on these gates. The white helmets are on the ground at the moment trying to unlock these gates so that these people can be free. But there is a real worry that they're not going to get to them in time, and that people are going to starve, and that they're going to run out of oxygen even. What can the British government can do and the international community do to ensure that in the next 24 hours more support is given to get technical support down onto the ground so that we can unleash those doors and get those political prisoners free?
Well, my honourable friend raises a really important issue, and I saw a scene of a young child, toddler, effectively walking out of a prison. So grim was the Assad regime. This is an issue that's commanded a lot of attention in the last few hours. We will continue to support civil society and the public services as best we can to get those individuals out. He will recognise that's against the backdrop of some constraint. We do not have a diplomatic presence in Syria, and we have not had for a very long time. But because he also mentions prisoners, we should never forget the 100,000 or more people who have simply disappeared. And we hope and pray that many of those people will come out from underground.
Sir Julian Lewis.
May I gently remind the House that one should never idealise the oppositions in these scenarios, and some of what I've been hearing today reminds me very much of what I heard in this House after the downfall of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. The truth of the matter is that in Syria it's a choice between monsters and maniacs, and I don't regret my votes either in 2013 and 2015 when the coalition wanted to bomb first one side and then the other in the same civil war. So can the Foreign Secretary throw some light on what he expects Turkey to do, having supported the Islamist opposition, now that it will be face to face with its Kurdish enemies?
Well, the chair of the Intelligence Select Committee is right to ex-chair of the Intelligence Select Committee, forgive me, is right to highlight the complexities of these issues. He will recognise that Turkey has the most complex of relationships with HTS, and in fact many have forgotten that HTS is a proscribed organisation in Turkey. They also have legitimate terrorist concerns that they have raised with this country on a number of occasions. Notwithstanding the complexity of the situation, we have to work with all groups in an inclusive manner, but I am minded to be really, really clear that in terms of the UK, we remain concerned about Daesh and extremism in some of the camps that we know exist in the northeast. We're very vigilant about those issues, and we're happy to work, or we have to work with Kurdish minority groups in order to assist us in that enterprise.
Debbie Abrahams.
Deputy Speaker, I wonder if my right honourable friend could share his assessment of the impact of the events in Syria on the stability of the wider Middle East, particularly thinking about Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and is there a particular role for UN Blue Helmets beyond the existing buffer zones, given what's happened around the Golan Heights?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises an important issue. On the one hand, some of what we're seeing in Syria is as a consequence of a diminished Hezbollah, a diminished Iran. On the other hand, we don't want to see further friction between Syria and its neighbours and those in the region. I saw the tanks that moved into the Golan Heights. I spoke to the Israeli Foreign Minister yesterday. He said that he believed that that was temporary, and it's in response to what they see as a breach of the agreement struck in the 1970s between the two parties, given that the Syrian regime have now fled that border. I hope that that is temporary, but I recognise the security concerns that do exist.
Dame Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The situation in Syria is inevitably going to lead to changes and increased pressure on migration routes. So can the Foreign Secretary confirm what steps the government has taken so far with regards to asylum claims from Syrian nationals? And can he commit to making sure the Home Affairs Select Committee is kept updated of any changes to be made in the future?
She's right to raise these issues. That's why I put it in my statement, and that's why we are working in country, both in Syria and with neighbours, to ensure that we do not have new migration routes open up. What we want is a safe and secure Syria network, which is inclusive for all communities, and we have to be mindful of that.
Steve Race.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as with many cities, Exeter is home to a Syrian refugee community who are frankly delighted by the demise of Assad's appalling regime. Can the Secretary of State tell me what efforts the government is able to undertake to support an inclusive political settlement that includes all of Syria's ethnic and religious groups, including, of course, the Kurdish community, potentially on the federal model that has proven to be successful elsewhere in the region?
Well, I'm grateful to the question, and I want to reassure him. We recognise that many Syrians who have found a home here in the United Kingdom are here specifically because Syria was not an inclusive place. So when we keep in mind and hold out for that inclusive place, our intent is to work with partners to try and bring that about. But the truth is, this has got to come from the Syrian people. The best we can do is to support public services, to support civil society. Long gone are the days when a P5 member such as ourselves seeks to construct the terms under which freedom is achieved. We have to work with partners on the ground.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement on this fast-evolving situation. And the Secretary of State has referred to the many displaced Syrians looking to return to Syria, for opportunities and risks. Will the government be providing assistance to those Syrians in this country who do wish to return to the homeland? And will the government look to follow the example of European nations like Germany, who have suspended asylum applications?
I have to say that has not been put to me in the last few hours. The issue that's been put to me is the humanitarian need in country, the humanitarian support for neighbours. And I think the consensus of this House and the significant funds that we have supported Syria with should reassure people of our content to support people on the ground in the region.
Barry Gardner.
35 years ago, as the evil regime of Erich Honecker collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down, the threat of chaos in East Germany was countered and that country reintegrated into Western Europe only with the investment of $2 trillion. Now, the Foreign Secretary quite rightly spoke of the dangers to the UK that continuing chaos in Syria could cause. If Syria is not to sink further into despair and the UK and other democracies not to feel the repercussions, where is the necessary investment for Syria's reconstruction going to come from?
Well, the right honourable friend raises an important issue looking ahead. He will recognise that there is a real bandwidth problem as we look across the world and the Middle East particularly. Many would like to see a ceasefire in Gaza. I certainly want to see a ceasefire in Gaza and the road to reconstruction begin there. Many want to see Putin exit his troops from Ukraine and face justice, and there will be reconstruction that is necessary there. So, of course, there is reconstruction that's necessary in Syria. But I just remind the House that this country has provided, across the last government and this government, £4 billion worth of aid. The UK taxpayer has played its part in supporting Syria. We've announced a further 11 million today. We continue to play our part, but no one would suggest that we could do that potential at all on our own.
David Reid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The situation in the Middle East is extremely volatile, and the situation that's played out in Syria over recent days only adds to that instability. Has the Foreign Secretary had conversation in recent days with MOD colleagues about the potential need to reinforce and bolster security in sovereign area bases in Cyprus?
Can I reassure the honourable gentleman those are ongoing discussions, as you expect, given the extent of the challenges in the Middle East, particularly the challenges previously in Lebanon.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The fall of Assad's regime marks a pivotal moment for Syria, offering a chance to end over a decade of brutal conflict and suffering at the hands of a man content with using chemical weapons against his fellow citizens. What steps is the Foreign Secretary taking to ensure that Britain works with international partners to secure a stable and inclusive future for Syria so that all Syrian people can finally live in peace and rebuild their lives?
We're grateful for the question and grateful to repeat that it's very important for me to speak to Emirati colleagues at this time, to Turkish colleagues at this time, to Jordanian colleagues at this time, and for the Foreign Office operation, of course, to be engaged with the United States and others to ensure that we see a transition to genuine representation that's inclusive.
Richard Ford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2013, this House voted against UK military action following the use of chemical weapons by Bashar al Assad's government. One effect of that vote was to deter the British government from taking action, but another effect of that vote was to have influenced the US government into taking no action at that time. For any future UK military action, will he support Parliament debating and voting on it, even if we've learned from 2013 that there may be times when such scrutiny should happen after military action takes place?
Well, I would say, and I say this drawing on my 24 years in this House, that military action is always taken by all members with a seriousness and a sobriety you see on no other issue that comes before this chamber. I don't think there's any disagreement about Assad in this House this evening, and it's important to remember that the person responsible for the crimes against the Syrian people is Assad and his brutal regime.
Chian Wara.
Deputy Speaker, the joy on the faces of Syrians and the horrors of the Syria prison emphasise both the evil of the Assad regime and the hope for the Syrian future my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, speaks of. But the complexity of the ethnic, religious, political and military groupings within Syria and the wider region, make the pathway to that stable, peaceful, inclusive Syria challenging, to say the least. What practical steps can the UK take to support the bringing together of the appropriate Syrian representatives who can help enable them to build the peaceful, stable Syria that we all wish to see?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and she's drawing on years of experience on these issues of cohesion and bringing different communities together. Over the coming days, I hope to see that inclusivity in action. I've said to the UN Special Representative that the UK stands ready to support him in whatever way he deems necessary, and clearly the UN will play an important role over the coming days. And as I said, I do think it's important that the regional actors, along with partners here in Europe and in the United States, are able to convene to ensure that this new rise in tide in Syria is able to keep alive the hope that the people are demonstrating on the streets.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The SDF is managing detention facilities with 9,000 Daesh fighters in Syria. What is the Foreign Secretary's assessment of the likelihood of ensuring the continued management of these facilities, keeping people who threaten our security imprisoned, and what action is he taking with allies to achieve that outcome?
Well, I've said in the House that this is the number one issue for the UK government. We will continue to work closely with partners both in country and neighbouring to ensure that safety for our population. This is a very serious issue, and of course, across all channels, the UK government is fully engaged.
Leslie Calliscan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I take the opportunity to welcome the government's decision to appoint Dame Margaret Hodge as the anti-corruption champion. She will of course do important work on illicit trading, not least in relation to drugs in Syria. We must not allow those routes to be a source of resource for violent terrorist groups. On the night where it looked clear the Assad regime was about to crumble, my constituents embarking, many of them watched minute by minute, those of Syrian background, highly emotional night for them. Along with the rest of the world, they saw the regime fall, and with it, decades of brutal rule that destroyed lives. Does the Minister agree with me that not only is this a moment of hope for the Syrian people, but is also a critical moment as we see the Russian and Iranian influence being pushed back in the region, which in turn is better for British national security?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I'm very grateful to her paying tribute to Baroness Margaret Hodge, who I think has been a doughty champion on issues of illicit finance, and I'm so pleased that she accepted this appointment, and I was with her this morning at the National Crime Agency, and she puts the joy and hope in the Syrian community in her constituency, their hearts, and as we're seeing right across our country and across the global community. And we have to do all we can to support that and hope and pray that Syria moves into a brighter future, understanding that this is one of the most ancient of countries that has been a home for so many communities and is one of the centres, really, of the birth of civilization.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, I think we all welcome the fall of the Assad regime, but it is important that he and his henchmen be brought to justice eventually. The problem, of course, is that, as we have seen in Iraq and Libya, the fall of a dictator swiftly like this leads to a dysfunctional state with all of the potential for immigration, illegal immigration, terrorism and many other problems. Is it realistic, and what can the Minister say in relation to, first of all, Britain's role in ensuring that Syria does not become a dysfunctional regime, But secondly, we prevent terrorism from moving from there into other parts of the world. And importantly, those who genuinely will have to seek asylum, what grounds can we take for dealing with those on the ground rather than pushing them in the hands of the people smugglers?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman centres justice at the heart of what he said, and he's absolutely right that quickly the joy will turn to an accountability for what went before, and I suspect we may see it coming out of the prisons as people begin to interrogate what happened to those 100,000 that disappeared. That people will want to hold those responsible accountable, and that's understandable. He also raises the importance of the counter-terrorism issues. Daesh's ability to direct and enable and inspire attacks within our country is significant, and we've seen them behind a lot of global events. That's why we're proud of the part that we play in the global coalition against Daesh and the work that we do in northeastern Syria particularly.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, what discussions are taking place with Turkey? Because the SDF in the north and the east of Syria are doing an important job in containing Daesh fighters, and it's essential that they're able to continue to do that. So, does the Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary, fear that the actions by Turkey may actually have a detrimental effect on the job that they're doing?
I want to reassure my honourable friend that I've had a good working relationship with the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. I spoke to him yesterday. I spoke to him last week, in fact, also in Malta. And I fully expect Turkey, as a member of NATO and a close friend of our country, to continue to work together on those pressing issues, recognising the threats to Turkey, but also the threats to the United Kingdom as well.
Saqib Bhatti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. I know it's a fast-evolving situation. In the coming days and weeks, he's going to have a think about the issue of diplomatic relations with Syria. Does he agree with me that one of the prerequisites to that relationship must be the handing over of any chemical weaponry that Assad has left behind? And will he work with the international partners to make sure that chemical weaponry is taken off the hands of anyone who wants to retain those, so it is destroyed and doesn't fall into the dangerous hands?
Good point.
Well, in so many ways, this horrid story, or at least the global attention on this horrid story, begins with the use of chemical weapons. It would be fitting to see them absolutely destroyed and taken away so they can be never used again. And it has been important to seek clarification that those who have led this rebellion are working with the OPCW and have set themselves against any use of chemical weapons and the preservation of those stockpiles.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for his statement today, and in particular for the diligent and hard work of his ministers, in particular the Minister for the Middle East, in keeping this House appraised of the ongoing issues, as he did last week, and in the background over the weeks prior to this. Last week I urged greater awareness of how these developments in Syria are interconnected, particularly to Russia's distraction and weakness. And I think we all welcome his remarks on the escalation of these matters to a cobra and the broad coalition that we all see on the front bench, in particular noting the security implications, the Home Office for its migration flows, and his own department and the Ministry of Defence role in any stabilisation work. And could he provide me, or us, this House, with a view on his department's ability to support such a significant piece of stabilisation activity alongside other work following the disbandment of a department which was its sole role? Also, as we know, the Russians have used their presence in Syria to expand their brutal security presence in other parts of the world, in particular Africa. And I'd like to know what steps we are taking to assess how these developments will impact African states that have learned to rely on Russia for their security, and if we've extended our hand of friendship to those states so that we have the opportunity, or they have the opportunity, to avoid the manifestation of these situations. And finally...
Members have to keep their questions short. Please, Foreign Secretary.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I could listen to my honourable friend all afternoon. But let me set about answering his questions. I'm very grateful that he mentioned the Honourable Member for Lincoln, because it enables me to thank him for the way that he is pursuing his role at this time, getting right across the region, right across the issue, and drawing on his own experience. He's right to raise the aid questions and how indeed that aid is spent. In the context of Syria, we are talking, sadly, about a civil society and NGOs that have been on the ground for many, many, many years. And so he can draw some confidence at the accountability in the way that we work with them. That was, for example, why we've made a further 300,000 available to the White Helmets, who have such a tremendous record. He's also right to talk about Africa and the way in which Russia has used Syria as a staging post for its actions in Russia. Of course, we're making the necessary assessments of that capability now that Russia has retreated.
Sheikh Bal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for his statement. I welcome his confirmation of the continuation of UK humanitarian aid to the people of Syria. I also welcome his commitment that the future governance of Syria must be decided by the Syrian people and not by foreign actors. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that a safe, secure, stable and prosperous Syria is not only in the interests of the Syrian people, but also in the interests of Britain? And will he commit the UK to taking all possible steps to support the peaceful transition to such a Syria?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and yes, I can confirm that.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the long overdue fall of Assad's murderous regime and recognise the joy, hope and also trepidation that so many Syrians are now feeling. It's disgraceful that the first thought of some has been to call for Syrian refugees to be forced to return, while the hard-right Austrian government has suspended family reunification and talks of resuming deportations. Will the government pledge its continued support to those who have fled Syria and made their home in the UK, and their freedom to choose whether they return or remain here?
I do think it's important, and my honourable friend is right to raise these issues, to remember that Syrians have now been in this country for many, many years indeed. Their lives are here, their children have been born here. These are just not the first issues that come to mind, but also to recognise that it's neighbouring countries, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, that bear the biggest amounts of displaced people who have had to flee Syria at this time. And we can see from the scenes in the region that Syrians are wanting to go back, are desperate to go back, and we should support them to do that in the public services that they will no doubt need.
Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for his statement today. No one should grieve the demise of Assad, who was propped up for far too long by Russia and Iran. However, HTS, with its links to Al-Qaeda, mean the future is far from certain or secure. With that in mind, can the Foreign Secretary set out what steps the government has taken to promote the rule of law in Syria?
Well, the honourable gentleman raises a very important issue. And 21 years ago, Al-Qaeda drove a truck bomb into our consulate in Istanbul, killing 16 British and Turkish members of staff. And we should never, ever forget that. So there was a serious context in which HTS was prescribed in the United Kingdom, having been an alias of Al-Qaeda back in 2017. I won't comment on issues of prescription, but these are sober, careful, considered issues that you'd expect any responsible government to look at with very, very careful detail indeed, working closely with partners like the United States and others for which this organisation remains prescribed.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Syrian diaspora in York will welcome the fall of the Assad regime, but what follows really matters. I want to ask the Foreign Secretary what discussions he's had with the International Criminal Court about the gathering of evidence, absolutely crucial at this time of transition in order to build the case for justice, which they have the responsibility of doing.
Well, can I assure my honourable friend that, of course, we will do all we can to ensure that Assad is held to account. And of course, he's now huddled up with that other war criminal, Putin, in Russia, who must also be held to account for his monstrous crimes.
Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, after 13 years of a devastating civil war and over half a century being brutalised by the Assad regime, I don't think anybody can deny Syrians their moment of joy over the weekend. However, to provide long-term stability in a Syria whose future is decided by Syrians, we need that long-term stability. So can the Foreign Secretary tell us, in the medium term, what work is being undertaken to analyse the situation by the Office for Conflict Stabilisation and Mediation, and will that be made available to the House? And in the shorter term, as we respond immediately, we've seen what can happen in other places after that moment of joy, and what lessons does the Foreign Secretary take from Iraq and Libya?
Well, can I assure the honourable gentleman, it's very worrying what has happened in Iraq and Libya, the vacuum that has engulfed those countries once a dictator left, and that leads then to sectarian violence and groups upon groups, and then a haven for terrorism. It's deeply, deeply worrying, which is why, despite the joy, we remain cautious, keen to work with partners on the ground, keen to support civil society, keen to encourage an inclusive society, as has been indicated by the UN Special Representative, and we will continue to do all we can to avoid the quagmire that could replace the fallen dictator.
Richard Bergen.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Foreign Secretary for his statement. It's been deeply moving to see Syrian families reunited after years in Assad's prisons. In relation to the wider situation, of course, it's important we learn the lessons from the past, not least from Iraq and Libya, where what replaced the dictatorships were years of even greater chaos and disaster for those people. Many countries are militarily involved in Syria, and obviously people don't want our military resources or troops being dragged into more wars in the Middle East in the future. So can the Secretary of State assure us that, distinct from welcome humanitarian aid, there'll be no military resources or personnel sent into Syria?
Well, I'm grateful for the way in which the honourable gentleman has outlined the dangers after a fallen dictator. He will understand that it would be wrong of me to comment on operational issues, but I find the scenario that he raises highly unlikely. I've used that on 3 occasions.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. As the people of Syria come out of the horrors of war and torture and imprisonment, and many into asylum, can we be assured that the foreign troops that are in Syria at the present time, particularly the Turkish troops in the north, will leave, and that they will respect the right of the Kurdish people to be able to live safely in their own area, and that any incoming government in Damascus will also respect the diversity of the country and all of the minorities, particularly the Kurdish minority. And in his discussions with the Israeli Foreign Minister, is he satisfied that Israel is going to withdraw immediately from the area it illegally occupied over the last couple of days, just north of the already illegally occupied Golan Heights?
We're in the early days of a fluid situation, so it wouldn't be for me to give the honourable gentleman the assurances that he seeks at this time, except to say that, of course, I continue to talk to our closest allies in the region about their security concerns and the issues before Syria at this time. Can I just say, in relation to the conversation I had with the Israeli Foreign Minister, there was an arrangement put in place. It was put in place in the 1970s. It has worked and sustained an arrangement in the Golan Heights, and their assessment was that with the withdrawal of the regime over the last few days and the potential for chaos, as has been discussed in this House and as indicated in his question, it did require them to protect that buffer zone. And as I've said, I hope that situation is temporary.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, as we've just heard, Israel did seize more territory in the Syrian-controlled Golan Heights. And the Foreign Secretary has just mentioned that Israel has mentioned it's going to be temporary. But it is recognised under international law as illegal. So I would like to know from the Foreign Secretary what will happen if the Israelis decide it isn't temporary.
Well, the Honourable Lady rightly says that it is illegally occupied, and I want to confirm from the dispatch box that it is the UK assessment, and that has been the case under successive governments, that this is occupied land.
Jim Allister.
Could I draw the Foreign Secretary back to a point raised by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, but I don't think fully addressed? Is there an assurance to this House that this government will block any asylum applications by Assad's acolytes in the years going forward?
I have seen mentioned in the last few days Asma al Assad potentially as someone with UK citizenship that might attempt to come into our country, and I want to confirm that she's a sanctioned individual and is not welcome here in the UK. And having appointed Margaret Hodge to her role this morning and taken such action on sanctions, more sanctions in the last 5 months under me than we saw even before in that space of time, let me reassure, I will do everything I can in my power to ensure that none of that family find a place in the UK.
John Slinger.
Deputy Speaker, I should declare an interest in that several years ago I advised the moderate Syrian opposition coalition and other moderates.
Hear, hear.
Does my right honourable friend agree that it's important, in order to ensure that the Syrian people are at the heart of the new Syria and to strengthen stability, that the new political structures are democratic and pluralistic, that the moderate opposition, who have dedicated themselves to planning for this day ever since the horrors of 2011, are closely involved, and that engagement with our allies and the United Nations, which I know is ongoing, is prioritised, particularly given UN Security Council Resolution 2254.
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that question and for his work and experience and dedication to these issues over many years. There has been a lot of focus on HTS, but he will recognise that those who freed Damascus contain many groups. There is many groups that make up the opposition They come from different positions. When we talk about an inclusive Syria, it's got to be a place that includes all of them. And he's right to put on record those groups that we have, in our own country, have been able to work with over many, many years.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his statement. And while the downfall of the Assad regime is to be lauded and that Damascus has been liberated, the same Damascus, of course, which was the earliest, one of the earliest places for Christianity being taught and preached, and as the Bible is mentioned, often mentioned in the good book in relation to that. The free world has failed in the protection of minority groups and religious beliefs, and need to be mindful that Turkey and Turkish-led terrorists are at this current time attacking Kurds in northern Syria. Since 2018, Turkey has killed, it is estimated, some 300,000 Kurds in northern Syria, with another 300,000 today facing that same fate. Furthermore, as Damascus has gained freedom, minorities in Syria must be protected against a very brutal and violent and evil HTS. So will the Secretary of State ensure that this transition peace government will engage to protect all religious minorities in Syria? Thank you so much.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman's right to remind the House of the ancient nature of Syria and the many, many religious communities that have found a home and make up Syria over those hundreds, thousands of years. We will continue to work with all such groups, and I think in his question it underlines the complexity and the challenges for Syria as we look ahead.
Damien Egan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Members across the House, including the Secretary of State, have talked about the religious and ethnic complexities of Syria. Wanted to ask the Secretary of State what he made of those who are calling for a federal-type system in Syria, and should the government be giving capacity and voice to those views and approaches?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for the question. There have been a number of propositions in the last few days, all of which merit further scrutiny and understanding. I'm not going to back, as the UK, any single suggestion. I do think it's important that these should come from organisations on the ground. I think it's important that we continue to work with regional partners. And I stand by what I said before at the dispatch box. Long gone are the days in which in the UK Foreign Office a plan is drawn up, presented as if this is the plan. That cannot be the way. We've got to work with the grain of Syrian society, as complex and diverse as he rightly suggests it is.
Alex Sable.
Speaker, like Minister Faulkner, I was at the Doha Forum this weekend, and there was palpable relief by the vast majority of delegates that the brutal murderer Assad had finally fallen. However, Sergei Lavrov also attended the Doha Forum, and although I boycotted his session, the readout was that he was deeply uncomfortable in answering questions about Syria, and rightly so, as he has so much Syrian blood on his hands alongside his boss, Vladimir Putin. Does my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, agree with me that it's unacceptable for Russia to retain its 2 military bases in Syria, and that they must be closed down for the stability of the region?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very strong point, indeed, about Russian capability and desire, those 2 bases that exist, those bases that also run operations into Africa and support militia groups in the African continent, and the long-standing cynical desire of Russia to have a deep-sea port in the region, which sat behind why Putin supported Assad in the first place. We see you, Vladimir Putin, in this Parliament.
Just a quick reminder, and I am going to run this statement to the end, but I think the Honourable Member referred to Minister Faulkner by name, which of course he should not have done. Graham Downey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his statement, the Foreign Secretary referred to HTS cooperating with the international community over monitoring chemical weapons. Given the situation on the ground in Syria at the moment and still the ongoing chaos, what confidence does he have that there's the capacity for HTS to conduct that work? And is there anything that the UK government can do to support the capacity in the region to keep those weapons safe?
Well, working with the OPCW on the ground is hugely important. The work of the UN envoy is essential here too. We will do all we can to ensure that those stockpiles are properly protected.
Andy MacDonald.
Deputy Speaker, it would be great jubilation to see the back of Assad, and I very much welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement and his reference to illicit finance, which is critically important, and of course the building of an inclusive society protecting minorities. This is a great moment of hope, but built with trepidation as well. He did speak of a new hope for Syrians getting their country back, and I'm grateful to him for his clarification over the Golan Heights. But whatever emerges from this transition, could he say something about, I know he's got that shared desire to seek a reliable partner and a support of democracy to replace this dreadful regime, but can he say something about the urgency and the time scale that we've got to establish that? What work is going on in that space with partners to make sure that this happens quickly?
Well, I'm very grateful to the interest that the Honourable Member has taken in these issues and in the region over many, many years indeed. He will understand that we are at the foothills here, that a lot has got to go in to stabilise Syria at this time. In that context, it is a little premature to give a timetable, although I understand why he wants one, because he wants the guarantee that things don't go south over the coming months. But the issues that I raised about oil and fuel and energy, around support for public services, I think is pressing on our minds around the disorder that we've got to ensure does not set in. And it's that we're working closely with partners on in the coming days.
Mark Stewards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the Foreign Secretary's statement and also the detailed and nuanced answers that he has given to what have been some very complex questions today. That's extremely welcome. One thing that isn't complex is the fact that Assad is a murderer, has taken 500,000 people's lives, and my right honourable friend was absolutely right to resist calls to reopen channels and negotiate with him. So I have two questions, one simple, one not so simple. The first is, does he agree that every single member of this House should welcome the downfall of Assad? And the second question is, does he have thoughts on what this means for Russia now? Given their catastrophic failure in Syria, will it change their behaviour in other conflicts? Will it change their behaviour in Ukraine?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his question. I think he can feel in this chamber the united position on Assad. We are one of the great democratic chambers of the world, and that's why we know a dictator when we see one, and we call that out across the House. I think the other point that he makes in terms of Putin is that I am always reassured in these moments that in the end dictators fall, because they never attend to all of their population. They always suppress the will of minority groups and opposition, and in the end they have to run their countries with a sort of horrible, horrendous iron rod, because they know, as we saw with those statues coming down, that there is a target on their back. That's the heart that I take in relation to the future of Vladimir Putin.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to echo the calls welcoming the downfall of the brutal and evil Assad regime, and just press the Foreign Secretary a little on what steps the government will take to preserve all humanitarian routes available and to ensure that the moderate, prosperous and indeed multipolar Syria emerges from the present situation.
The 11 million that I've announced, further aid that supports those civil groups, the conversations that I've said today with regional partners to ensure that those routes are available, and you know, it's good to see people feeling able to return home.
to swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend is right in his statement to emphasise the effects of global instability on illegal immigration into the UK. So supporting displaced Syrians as they return home is not only the right thing to do, although it is the right thing to do, it also supports the security of the UK. So can he assure this House that Syrians returning home will have the ongoing support of this government in terms of humanitarian support?
Yes, I'm very pleased to say that at Dispatch Box.
Paul War.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I join the Foreign Secretary and the Shadow Foreign Secretary and everyone across this House in welcoming the demise of Assad's brutal regime? But unlike my predecessor in Rochdale, Mr George Galloway, who tweeted his support for Assad this weekend,
Shameful.
much to the disdain of many in my constituency, I do not mourn Assad's demise, and we shouldn't be surprised by Mr Galloway, given that he's long been a friend of dictators across the planet. But can I remind the Foreign Secretary that Assad was no friend of the Palestinian people. He bombed, he tortured, he murdered Palestinians who stood up to him. And does my honourable friend recognise their bravery today too?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to remind the House that our own democracy has demagogues and charlatans too that can prey on individuals. And also to remind us that really so few were safe in Assad's brutal regime that saw the murder of hundreds of thousands of people disappearing on a scale that certainly the 21st century had not seen, the use of chemical weapons, and that he has found safe comfort in Russia is frankly appalling. He should be rotting in a jail for all that he has done.
Sam Rushworth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And like many in this House, I've campaigned with and wept with Syrian friends over much of the last decade in their struggle and welcome the demise of Assad. But the Secretary of State is absolutely correct that it's for the Syrian people to decide what happens next, though I greatly fear that there will be many Syrian people whose voices will not be heard unless they're given strong international support to be heard. There is a strong pro-democracy and pro-human rights movement in Syria, particularly amongst women and youth-led organisations. What's the government doing to ensure that the voices of women and youth are heard?
He's absolutely right to raise the importance of women and youth. Women have been mentioned, but youth not so much this afternoon. And I've been aware of youth groups in Syria over many, many years, and we will do all we can to amplify those voices at this time.
Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for that statement and